Welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about the tragedy that is Niki Lauda dying. He was a motor racing icon, a legend. We have two experts, dare I say, in Formula One and two non-experts. But we've all heard of him. That's the point, isn't it?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Yes.
You haven't?
Yes. No, of course. No, of course.
Because there was the movie, there was the story of the comeback.
Exactly. And I have to admit, for an American, Formula One isn't sort of the sine qua non.
So it's IndyCar.
Well, no, he is somebody everyone knows. I mean, that's the whole point of today, that we all know the name. And if we don't know everything about the name, that name exists. And he's very much a part of the whole culture of Formula One. And he's a big part of the 70s and the 80s, very much so. Even if you don't know anything or care anything about Formula One, Niki Lauda jumps out very much so as a stellar presence and an important person.
I say you're an expert, but you've got an interest, haven't you, in the business side of Formula One, which is massive compared actually to the audience.
Yeah, it's a dedicated audience, I think we should say. We may well have people watching now who are saying, yep, you know, the followers are really dedicated followers. But as Bonnie just said, it's a global sport, but it doesn't necessarily have the kind of global audience you might associate with, say, football. Although I think for America it's soccer, but you know, you get the point. But in terms of the business, it's absolutely huge. I mean, F1 is now actually owned by an American company. Remember, Bernie Ecclestone owned F1, but the individual teams, it's a multi-million pound sport for every single team. And in fact, one of the challenges about the sport is that it has become so expensive or so rich that working class drivers, Lewis Hamilton, one of the best known F1 drivers, he's one of only 20 of the current F1 drivers. He's the only one out of those 20 who actually comes from a working class background, because it's expensive to get a seat in the races, to go from go-karting all the way up to F1, if you can be one of those 20 that actually makes it. And then, of course, the expenditures by the owners. It's not just on developing the drivers. The cars are incredible works of technological machinery, and the R&D that goes into that is extraordinary.
But they've been trying to open it up, though, haven't they? And Niki Lauda was actually part of that as well.
Yeah, Niki Lauda was not only a Formula One driver, he was one of the biggest advocates of the sport. He was passionate about it, and I consider it a real privilege in my life to have been able to sit and talk to Niki a number of times about it, and you could see the passion, his love of it absolutely emanating kind of from every bone in his body, and the future of the sport really cared to him. He was a big advocate for the safety of the sport, but you know, he doesn't mince his words, Niki. He knew what a real driver should be, and he felt that the drivers should be fighting for every victory. It shouldn't be just the cars doing the job. And if a driver was, in his opinion, maybe, you know, loving the lifestyle a little bit too much, he enjoyed that. But if they weren't performing on the track, he was really having none of it.
Do you think they've got an image problem in the sport because it's so elite?
I think they definitely do now, and that's one of the things that stands out about Lauda, is that he's part of that generation. He's at his peak just after as Ecclestone is taking over, and as it's moving from this sort of romantic, old school endeavour, chivalry, bravery, and all the rest of it, into the big business of the 80s and 90s and beyond. And there's something in his personal story, the way in which the crash happens, and the way in which he survives and is rescued from the flames, which makes him such a figure.
Yeah. We're coming to the TV show. Welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about Niki Lauda today. CNN Talk. How has motorsport changed since his day on the track? Many people arguing that was the golden era of Formula One.
Sad news from the world of sports. Three-time Formula One champion Niki Lauda has died.
The Austrian-born race car driver won 2 titles with Ferrari in the 1970s.
And a third with McLaren in 1984.
If you want to be 3, 4, 5-time world champion, you always have to be better.
Lauda had a near-fatal crash in 1976, which left him badly burned.
He lost one of his ears. He then took to wearing the red cap, which he became so synonymous with. For many people, they thought that was the end of Niki Lauda. He came back just 40 days later.
So I tell you from my own experience, winning is one thing, but out of losing, I always learned more.
There is no doubt Niki Lauda was a legend.
On Facebook, David says, motorsport has become so boring. Lily says, R.I.P. Niki, you will be sadly missed. And Jacqueline says, R.I.P. Niki. And thank you. Thank you as well if you were listening on the podcast, on Apple Podcasts. Amanda, when the news came through, I mean, this is, a towering figure in sport, not just motorsport. You met him many times. I mean, what was your reaction? What does it mean for sport?
I mean, firstly, it was incredibly sad news to wake up to. It has very publicly been the case that for the last 12 months, Niki Lauda has been suffering from some pretty serious health issues. He underwent the double lung transplant last year. He was re-hospitalized in January, suffering from flu. And the statement that we received from his doctor in Switzerland, in Zurich, he'd been moved to a hospital in Zurich, said that sadly the news didn't come as a great surprise. Ultimately, with everything, his body had just had enough and he couldn't fight anymore. And it's incredible, the outpouring, really, from across the motorsport community, with so many people paying tribute to him, really highlighting what a loved individual Niki Lauda was, and respected individual, not just for his driving days, but also as a personality. Because, sometimes in this sterile era of sport, sports people and people involved with sport are criticised for not really speaking their mind, being a little bit too private. You never, ever had that issue with Niki. You knew exactly
always a good
what
interview.
he was thinking, when he was thinking.
Yes.
And for me, walking around the paddock, you would look and you'd first off see a big crowd of people. And then in the middle of that crowd, you would see his iconic red cap that he took to wearing it in recent times. And that was the kind of man Niki was. Everybody wanted to hear his take on what was going on.
It's interesting hearing Amanda describe what a colourful character he was. People on Facebook saying it's become boring. Does he represent something different, a different era where it was more about, it was more exciting, actually?
I think in a lot of ways he was part of that era where motorsport probably was just hitting maybe a peak in terms of producing the personalities. And Niki Lauda was certainly one of the greats, if not the great. I'm sure that's going to be a debating point. But there's also his great rivalry with James Hunt. There was Senna, who was another legendary driver at the time. There were these famous rivalries in the sport in the 70s and the 80s. And he was certainly a part of that. I think that was really why, if you look at these big personalities, it kind of gives you a sense of the perseverance that individuals have to overcome in this sport. So I suppose you could say today, motorsport is very technological. And so the cars play a huge part in terms of the success of the team and the drivers. And that might move it a little bit away from, and that might feel, we can discuss it a little bit more, that might feel a bit safer, which is a good thing. But in terms of the cars being more of the focus versus the earlier era, where I think maybe the drivers had a bigger role to play. And of course, the thing about perseverance, I mean, Niki Lauda is famous for, we've heard there in the, in the package, that he literally raced weeks after a horrific accident. And that kind of thing, I think, cements his legend a bit.
And if we're going to show the incident, which, so many people will remember, we're only showing it because it really defines his story, doesn't it? It was August 1976. His car crashes. Amanda was telling us earlier on CNN how, people assumed that he was going to die in hospital, but then he made a comeback. And there's this idea that, you had the jeopardy in the races then that you don't have now. Not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah. Well, as you indicated, it made it perhaps more exciting to watch. But the sport was then, it was really just hitting a sweet spot. It had this reputation for adventure. he introduced the concept a little bit of chivalry, if you like, and the sportsmanship involved in terms of how he was rescued. It's an amazing comeback story as well, because he's racing pretty quickly afterwards. But I mean, the whole history of, he's bound up with the whole history of Formula One, which has, but at that point, I mean, it's gone from really this rather amateurish but endearing attempt in the late 1940s, 1950s, which is after the war, to try and get people racing again, to try and get the Italians and the British and the Germans playing together again and cooperating. And then it just, with sort of pop culture in the 60s, people like Jackie Stewart, it just starts to create these personalities who become almost like rock stars, if you like. And in the 70s, it has the perfect combination, just because it's starting to get business oomph as well. But it's before, arguably, it becomes truly, truly commercial, and Eccleston really does his thing in the 80s.
But let's not forget, and I'm old enough to say this, that in the 60s, it was about the car. These things were beautiful. I mean, you went to Formula One, not only to see a race, you went to see a car. We don't have cars anymore, okay? And that's really important. I didn't give anything about, necessarily the race. It was the driver and the car. And I remember back at the end of the 60s, maybe early 70s, there was a big movie called Grand Prix with Steve McQueen, James Garner. It was about the car, and it was about the man. It was always men, of course, and the whole culture of Grand Prix. But it was also about that beautiful thing that I have brothers, and my brothers played with these cars. We've lost that. Part of what Eccleston, I don't know a lot about it, but what he brought in was to reduce the car. Okay, the car becomes a computer, becomes a thing that gets these guys across. And what Lauda did, he was like a knight, in a sense. He was on a horse, and it was him with this beautiful Ferrari, this beautiful whatever he drove, and that's what you felt. And I think now when people say it's boring, it's partly because it is an individual sport. It is the individual thing, but that lovely machine gets smaller and smaller.
I think there would be,
there will be some that disagreed with that.
I think Eccleston and I think the current generation of Formula One drivers and teams would maybe argue with that.
Okay.
The cars certainly look different, but it is still very much about developing the car, developing the technology. And I think where Lauda was racing and this period, there was the real recalibration of, yes, we want it to be a sport, we want it to be dangerous, we want to showcase the drivers, but equally, too many of our friends and colleagues have died doing what they love. So even ahead of that race where Lauda crashed, he had been banging the drum saying, this circuit isn't safe for us to race. It's too big a circuit. It's not safe for the drivers. The emergency services can't cover that. And actually, when he did come back later that season in 76, the reason he lost the title was because he stood up ahead of the race in Japan and said, it's raining, it's too wet, I'm not going to race.
The only thing I was saying is I agree with you 100%, 100%, and that is Lauda's contribution to this sport, to say, hold it. It's not about all these beautiful cars. We're driving these cars. I think what I'm talking about is the aesthetic. The aesthetic of Formula One itself, which was in Lauda's day, and maybe the danger was part of the aesthetic, and that's what we had to sacrifice. But the aesthetic of Formula One is not there.
But it was
anymore.
also then, Bonnie, it was the glamour. If you watch this very famous documentary made about Jackie Stewart, which films during the Monaco Grand Prix. So it's the absolute sort of height of late 60s, early 70s glamour. These are locations that audiences haven't necessarily been to or
aesthetic
seen.
of it, yes.
So that idea of travel, glamour, rock stars at the by the side of the track, the parties before
Music.
and after.
Amanda reporting.
All of that.
But that's a lot of what Liberty, the new owners, since they've come in, they felt that it went too much down the road under Eccleston of being a sporting business. And Liberty, the American owners, have said, no, we want to bring more of the US spin into sport, and it needs to be sport with entertainment. So that's why they're bringing Usain Bolt to start a race. Around each race weekend, there's the concerts. It's not just about people buying tickets to watch the racing. It's everything else around it. They're really trying to open it up with the esports, with the Netflix documentary. I was speaking to Sean Bratches, who's head of commercial with Formula One, part of the Liberty Triumvirate, who are bringing the sport forward. And he said the fan for us is now at the centre of everything.
Why is it so
decision.
unaffordable then to go to these races?
It is hard. It is expensive, and I don't know about that part of the business model. Attending, for instance,
I don't think
big
it is.
corporate
I don't think
boxes,
it's relative to football, which is 90
that's right,
minutes.
yeah.
It is that unaffordable for people. Yes, there are distances if you're a fan. You know, to travel from the UK
Well,
to
this is the
Amsterdam.
map of the races. You have to travel across.
I think
these countries to get really involved.
No, that's right. So we talked about Monaco, Singapore. And actually, the cities pay a lot of money to host the races because it does come with all this glamour. It's entertainment.
But who can afford to go to Bahrain?
But isn't it primarily
Exactly. I think that is that is actually a big part of it. Yeah, I think a lot of it is that it's hard to, so I've been at these races, and literally, if you're standing next to the racetrack, you can only see.
Which is an amazing thing to get to do, actually, compared to a lot of sports. You literally can stand on the bank.
So the speed of it is fine.
The noise is worth it.
But if you think about sort of it being a TV sport, you can see the whole race if you're actually watching it on TV. Whereas if you're there, you see a part of it. So that might be part of it. But just coming back to this car thing, I once asked the owners of a few of these F1 teams a very unfair question, which is if you had to go for the best driver or the best car, which would it be?
And they said?
What did they say?
The car.
Yes.
It's the car and the
Still about
engine
the car.
every time.
It's about the mechanics of the car.
Whereas we think of it as the personalities, the Lewis Hamiltons, the Jensen Buttons, the kind of entertainment almost aspect of it. But I think for the businesses, it's the cars. And it's expensive, I think, for the drivers to be in that position because to be recognized, as we were saying a moment ago, I think it is a multi-million-dollar sport. And to go from go-karting into the various levels, GP3, to get to the F1, I mean, there are 20 F1 drivers. So it's expensive to be part of this sport. And the whole thing is a big business.
Well, it's interesting, Amanda, you talk about the United States, because that's going to be a very interesting sort of conundrum and collision in the sense that Formula One is not inherently American. It's not an inherently American sport. I mean, America has other sports that have to do with racing, like stock and all of that, which has a kind of feeling behind it. Formula One is, in a sense, the opposite of that in a way. So it's going to be really interesting. And I think it goes back to what Ian was saying. It's going to be about television in the end. And the other part of it, too, is I live near that part of the world and in the south of France. And Monaco is a very interesting place, besides, terribly rich people. There's also...
I can see you there.
No, I know you've seen it there. There's also a culture that we've lost, and the fact that this kind of racing, people used to, as you say, it was local. It was in the street. I mean, you go into Monaco, and it's literally in the street. It's in the street. And you're shocked when you realize that. If somehow the Americans kind of bring that feeling about it being erupting in your street, I think that is really a lot of what it is.
So it's very interesting. They say in terms of the next markets where they want the new races to go. The US and China are the two big markets that they're looking at.
Yeah.
And whilst they've been doing show runs of cars in cities, we've had them in London, they have had them in Austin in the US as well. We have the circuit race in Austin, which has been there, but they're looking for another race in the States as well. And what has been talked about, Miami, but they're having issues with the authorities in Miami. That would be a street race running along...
In the street,
along the beach. The other one that has been talked about is New York, New Jersey.
Wow.
The other one, through the streets in Vegas, which actually Lewis Hamilton said to me a good few years ago, he would love that. I mean, in terms of glitz and glam through the streets of Vegas, but it's not as easy as just Formula One ringing up and saying, we're just going to run a race, is it? There's a whole lot of negotiation and politics.
Risa says, I know him, Lauda, from the movie. What she's obviously referring to is Rush, which was 2013, wasn't it? Let's have a little look at that.
42 days after his near-fatal accident, Niki Lauda will race here today. More powerful than the fear of death. is the will to win.
A really good example of how you can, that's how he became famous to many people, actually, not from the original racing, obviously.
Well, it's an incredible story involving another driver who, of course, then died very, very young and was a real party
So a comeback
animal.
story, not necessarily even a Formula One story.
Yeah, well,
Exactly.
I suppose that's the key. But the key thing about Lauda is that in adversity, triumphing against the odds and coming back, and he should have died that day in the car, and was extremely lucky to live. And human beings like that story, and he's a prime example of it.
I think it introduced, as you say, a new audience actually to Niki Lauda, and also almost a reminder of what we've been discussing in terms of that period. Yeah, that era. I mean, it was an extraordinary rivalry. James Hunt came from a very British, posh background, and then you had Niki Lauda, who was very technical. He was Austrian. He was very sort of precise. And Hunt was played by Chris Hemsworth, of course. Was all flamboyant, had the girlfriends, and then you had the studious Niki. And watching their rivalry as all these stories go, it was an extraordinary story. The movie is fantastic. It has that scene you described where he was worried about safety. He said it was raining.
Well,
they
was being a
shouldn't
bit
race,
cynical about the rivalry earlier on.
Well, no, absolutely. They were great rivals. But I think Niki says we really weren't the enemies that we were portrayed as.
As a movie.
Exactly. And for the narrative and for the film, it worked very well. But they had great respect for each other, great friendship for each other. And actually, I think you can take a lot from that if you look at selling Formula One now, today. We've had the Netflix documentary that they ran last season, which Ferrari and Mercedes, the two top teams, declined to be part of, which at the time everybody said, that's a nightmare. How can you have a serious Formula One documentary without the big boys involved? But actually, in hindsight, people I know who've seen it both within the sport, outside the sport, say actually, maybe it did them a favour. It meant it wasn't ruled by Lewis Hamilton and his battle with Sebastian Vettel. We got to see some of the other personalities, see some of the other stories that were playing out. Roman Grosjean really fighting for his seat, going through the mental turmoil that people were writing him off, saying he's lost his ability as a driver, but again, finding it within himself, fighting back. Carlos Sainz, the young Spaniard, trying to beat Fernando Alonso, who'd been his great boyhood hero. There are a lot of these stories that can be told, should be told, and are very human, engaging stories.
How has motorsport changed? We're talking about since Niki Lauda's day, and Bonnie is going to speak at great length.
No,
after
not
the break of
necessarily.
that. I interrupted you. I always feel so bad.
Don't live in Monaco. Don't put that out there.
Have you-
Nice,
I live
which
in
is much
Nice.
nicer.
Yeah.
It is nicer in Nice.
Nicer in Nice, yeah.
It is nicer.
Not this
Self-driving
weekend, it's a nightmare,
NASCAR would be cool.
That's a horrible thought.
That's
It's just
what
the
Lisa
worst
says.
thought. Who said that?
Monaco.
Somebody from Florida.
Lisa
Everybody's
says
going
that.
to Monaco now.
That's a horrible
Self-driving. Lots of people just saying RIP, you'll be missed. Let us know where you're writing from, and also sort of what he meant to motorsport for you and how you think motorsport's changed. Hiran says motorsport has become safer. If the cars in Moss or Lauda's day hit a curb, they would crash. Lauda was a legend.
Can I say something about Lauda and Lewis Hamilton? Because something Amanda said made me think about them both. In a sense, they both came from milieus that were not taken seriously, in a sense. I mean, Niki Lauda was an aristocrat. I mean, frankly, his
family wanted him to join the family business.
Yeah, he was an aristocrat. He literally was. So to come into that and to go and step down into a cockpit and with these greasy sort of people doing his car was horrible. And Lewis Hamilton comes from the other end, but exactly the same sort of thing. Somebody who isn't on that track, or he certainly isn't in that car. Neither's Lauda, neither's Hamilton. So for me, looking at both of them, very interesting kind of characters.
We're asking how motorsport has changed since Niki Lauda was on the track. He's died, of course. Sat Shield on Facebook says he was a phoenix, literally rose from the ashes to soar again. And Klaus says, as a TV commentator, which obviously he did later on, He always told the truth and allowed extraordinary glimpses behind the curtains. Let's hear what he himself said about how the sport has changed. This was him speaking to Amanda in 2016.
Today's Formula One cars are easy to drive. They have narrow tires. Aerodynamic helps.
But is that right?
Wrong. Therefore, something has to be done. Therefore, 17 new cars will come, more difficult to drive. They should be 5 seconds quicker than the existing ones. And the drivers should be alone in charge of driving the cars.
Leave him alone.
Yeah.
Max, I've got to. This, I think, will always be one of my fondest memories of Niki before we go on to his thoughts on the sport. Away from the race weekends, he would be the first out of a paddock on a race weekend on his jet, back to Vienna. And his first responsibility was the next morning he would get up and he would take his young twins to school. He would walk them to school. He would then go to that hotel, the Imperial Hotel in Vienna, where he would have his breakfast. And they've actually named a breakfast after him. But essentially his breakfast was eggs and coffee, and he'd sit with his newspapers, catch up on the news. And there were a couple of times, both on camera and off camera, I was lucky enough to share those moments with him. But yeah, very, very special. But yeah, he is a true racer. I think that's all you need to kind of say from that. And as much as he wanted the safety and the progress of the sport, ultimately he wanted the drivers to be able to drive, and that's how they win the races.
And the Viennese, go to the cafe, have your coffee, have your eggs. It's the first thing, not necessarily the eggs, but go to the cafe, have your coffee. That's Vienna. And that's really quite gratifying to hear, actually, because when you see him, he's usually quite, he's laying the law down, or he's talking about things. And to see him as this real Viennese is, in the true sense of the word, is wonderful. And the other thing, too, is I was thinking about him and Lewis Hamilton, and both of them, in a sense, are the beginning and the end of something in a very interesting way. Lauda was an aristocrat, a minor aristocrat, but he came from somewhere where you didn't get into a cockpit. You didn't do that kind of thing. You didn't get down with in the racetrack. You sponsored a car. You were there at the car. But you weren't in the car. And Lewis Hamilton, the same. You're not in the car. Lewis Hamilton's whole thing was about helping the car. He's not in the car. So these two guys come together in this kind of outsider complicity, which I think keeps F1 alive. So it doesn't become a techno sport. You got these rebels in it.
It doesn't just keep F1 alive in those kind of terms. It was Niki who persuaded Lewis to go to Mercedes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing.
And the result, we know what's happened. Mercedes have won their 5 titles. And
the sportsmanship behind it, I think, is what we were talking a lot about, the technology behind it and the sport. But to me, the essence of a sport is whether or not the drivers truly want to win. Lauda wanted to win. He raced because he wanted his 3 titles. Lewis Hamilton is one of the most competitive people. Any sport. And to me, that's the essence of the sport. And if he's promoting that, which he did throughout his life, Niki Lauda, he was very active as a spokesperson. Also, he owned a couple of airlines and things like that. He did other things. But I think being the non-executive chairman of a major team, I think he really did help Mercedes and keep that sportsmanship, that drive, that willingness to win.
Back to the Austrian theme is Arnie. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the other famous Austrian. Niki was a champion. He was an icon. He was an Austrian treasure. He was one of my dear friends. I'll miss this generous, trailblazing hero with my whole heart. There have been so many tributes to him today. I mean, that's just one of them.
Yeah, he's clearly an extraordinary personality. But I was just wondering there, talking to Bonnie about the comparison with Lewis Hamilton, is that it may just be a consequence of these things becoming increasingly globalized, that as you're trying to appeal to lots and lots of different audiences, it just becomes sort of blander, and that it produces characters like that who are. I mean, Lewis Hamilton is an extraordinary sportsman. I'm not denying that, but he's not, in personality terms, as interesting as Lauda or Jackie Stewart or Senna.
You have to go through the system in a way that in many other sports you don't.
There's that, but it's a flip side of the creation of Formula One as a global business is an amazing business story. And Eccleston spots, it's very similar, the parallels with the music industry, spots the way in which this has the potential to go global, and that there are there's a whole new sort of pipeline of consumers who are going to be prepared to follow this and really take an interest in it. The difference, of course, with the music industry is that it can then be disrupted by digital. The beauty of Formula One as an industry, which is that if you own the teams and you own the rules and you own the TV rights, you can't disrupt
People are
it.
suggesting
It's there as long as
self-driving
it's
cars
interesting.
on the Facebook. It could be the
Ian,
next phase.
just to push back on you a tiny bit, I mean, to go back to what Linda said, basically, where these two people meet, Niki Lauda and Lewis Hamilton, is they want to win. And winning is an individual quest. There's nothing to do with anything else. And so what you watch with Niki and what you watch with Lewis, and I'm very moved when you said that they knew each other and they were friends, because that makes sense to me, is this incredible drive and it's individual to win. What we're losing is the individual will to win and in this collective, do you like me? Am I okay? Do I look good age that we live in now?
What's your headline today with your sports shows in relation to this story to finish off with?
That Formula One sport has lost a true legend. And I think we use that term too freely, too often in sport, probably across life. But for me, when you look across the tributes, the word that comes up time and time again with reference to Niki is unique. And he really was both on and off the track, and will be very, very big shoes to fill. I'm not sure they will be filled.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for watching as well. You can listen again by going to Apple Podcasts, looking up CNN Talk.